I'm very excited to introduce this morning's panel. The focus for today's blockchain breakfast is, of course, blockchain in the state of Delaware. And we have a unique opportunity to hear some real insight from the premier state in the United States that is looking at blockchain in a very serious and effective way.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for having all of us here today. I'm a Delaware lawyer. I was most recently with the State of Delaware, heading up Global Delaware. I am the founding director of the Delaware Blockchain Initiative, but since I'm not with the state, I'm no longer the director there. And I'm currently a consultant working on business development, focusing on blockchain, but many subjects. Good morning. Thank you, Alexandra, for the opportunity to come along. Formerly the Symbiont, which was the partner of the state, Mark Smith, the CEO of Symbiont, created the idea, and worked with Marcus Mentori to implement the law through Andrea in the state last June. The law passed with only one vote against it, either both the Senate and the House in the state, and was signed into law last summer. I spent 22 years before joining Symbiont working on Wall Street, where I most recently was a managing director of the pension business at Morgan Stanley.
I'm Parth Munshi. I'm the Delaware partner of CKR's Global Office, corporate and securities attorney. And I think there's some great opportunities that Delaware is putting in place, and thanks Josh for putting this together, and look forward to hearing everybody talk about it.
Hi, I'm Greg Strong. I'm the Investor Protection Director in Delaware, so I work in the Attorney General's office. I've been there for about 14 years, and I've done a variety of things, but the Investor Protection Unit is responsible for registering securities and enforcing the Delaware Securities Act when necessary. So I just wanted to thank CKR for inviting me to participate, and I thought it's an interesting panel.
So can I get a brief survey? Just how many in the audience are attorneys? Great. How many are investors in this space? How many are startup founders / developers? Okay, great. Is there anyone totally new to blockchain in digital currency? Don't be embarrassed.
Not a single one.
Awesome. Okay, great. So that's helpful for us, obviously, in terms of our comments. So why don't we get started? Andrea, can you tell us a little bit about the Delaware Blockchain Initiative?
Sure. The Delaware Blockchain Initiative was created to demonstrate the state's commitment to the technology. The idea was that the governor would announce, and this was Governor Jack Markell, would announce that the state supported the technology, would use the technology in state government. And he also made a request to the Corporation Law Council. Delaware is very unique in that it has a sitting committee of very fine attorneys. And their job, when they're meeting as the council, is to review the opinions of the Court of Chancery and the Supreme Court, the corporate opinions and business opinions that come from those courts, and decide together, collectively as a group, do they think the judges got it right, which is kind of a pretty unique thing. So they meet, they convene, and every year they review these opinions, and they tweak the law. They suggest amendments, and those amendments are taken generally to the legislature, and for the most part, the legislature relies on the judgment of the lawyers, and I think generally they pass the law. In fact, I don't think there's been a time they haven't. So it was really a very strong endorsement of blockchain and its importance to the state and to the corporate community that then Governor Markell formally asked the Corporation Law Council, would you please amend the law to specifically, expressly allow companies to maintain their corporate records on a blockchain. Before the amendment was passed, the law contemplated that an individual, like a human being, would maintain the corporate records. A corporate officer would maintain the corporate records. So when you have that kind of law on the books, as well I'm sure most states, when they pass their laws, can imagine that there could be the kind of technology that could do the types of things that corporate officers and other individuals would do. So without that law change, it would, it would really be impossible to use blockchain technology to track, manage the stock ledger. So when he made that request, that formal request, and he did it in a very, very public way at the consensus conference, in 2016, and I'm asking the Corporation Law Council please to amend the law, that was pretty serious. And the Corporation Law Council, they took that job very seriously, and they met, and they spent an entire summer meeting with professionals and experts. And these were lawyers, when we first had the idea, when I first met with Marco Santori and with Mark Smith, the CEO, and we all went together, and at the time it was the head of the Division of Corporations, Rick Eisenberger. And we started all learning about blockchain technology. We thought, wow. And I'm sure most of you have had that moment, wow, this is a big deal. This could be huge. And you read, could this be? Is this really true? Yes, it is. And we would talk about that. And so the Corporation Law Council took this very seriously, and at the end of this, after a period of time, they agreed with the governor, and they moved forward. So the idea, what was the DBI? Big digression. Embrace the technology, use the technology, change the laws to allow companies, corporations to embrace the technology. And actually, as part of that initiative, he asked me to, at the time, call me an ombudsman, but that was just a very complicated term, so we changed it to director. And then I sort of ran with it. And we had inquiries far and wide, internationally, within the state. We really tried to educate our professionals, our lawyers, our executives in the state, and now we have a lot of folks who are very. Delaware is probably the most blockchain engaged state. I mean, aside from, let's say, Dubai. We're in Dubai. I don't know if you're following Dubai, but I was just there like 2 weeks ago at a conference. Dubai is 100%. They have a mandate to take all of their government processes and put it on a blockchain. I mean, it's huge. Smart system, amazing. And they're already reconciling, payments with 15 banks. But aside from maybe Dubai, maybe other Vermont, I saw they're putting their real estate records on blockchain. But the people of Delaware, the professionals, the lawyers, the bankers, the executives, they're really blockchain focused. And a lot of it has to do with this initiative. So, people are pretty excited, and the work is happening, and it started with the blockchain initiative.
So in terms of the amendments themselves,
Yeah.
what do they actually permit or not permit?
The blockchain amendments permit corporations, when they incorporate, to maintain their stock ledger on a blockchain. What they don't permit, a company can't have two types of shares. They can't have traditional shares and then digital shares. You have to be all in. The company has to have only digital shares on the blockchain. The amendments did other things. For the first time, the law defined what a stock ledger needed to have. I can't tell you the criteria, but that had never been defined in Delaware law before. So that was, and there were some other changes, but the biggest was the removal that you needed to have a corporate officer, and that the technology. And what I thought, the other thing, what I really think is the most important thing about the amendments is that when you have the legislature of a state like Delaware, where corporations are so important, they're saying, we believe that if you use this technology, no one's going to hold you accountable. You're never going to be, for using the technology alone, no one can bring a lawsuit against you and say you've breached your fiduciary duty. Because that's really what everybody's concerned about in Delaware. Delaware Corporation, that they're going to make a mistake and the board is going to be impugned. They're going to be attacked because of that. So by passing this law, it really was a huge endorsement. Huge. I mean, some states have passed legislation saying, you can submit evidence from a blockchain can't be brought into a court of law, can't be attacked by virtue of the fact that it's from a blockchain. Or a signature, another state, I think it was Arizona and Nevada, have said you can have a signature on a blockchain and we find that will be legitimate. Okay, good. But for a state to say, companies, you can go ahead and put your most important data and information on blockchain and no one can sue you for breach of fiduciary duty for doing that. that basically, I mean, once you say that, you really don't need to say anything else. At least that's my impression.
So how does this affect existing companies that are already, I mean, you mentioned you can't have both traditional shares and digital shares, but what about companies that are already, Delaware corporations in existence? How does this affect them?
They're going, what they will need to do is
Or
if they,
publicly traded companies?
yeah, well, let's just talk about companies that have issued shares that are not, on a blockchain. They will have to talk to a lawyer if they want to put those shares and maintain their corporate records. And I know that this is in the works with certain companies are doing this. There will need to be some legal acrobatics or creativity to say, okay, how do we do that? And I know that there are companies and lawyers thinking this through and figuring out how the best way, and articles being drafted, and I can make referrals to the lawyers who are working on that. Yeah, I'm sure. So maybe, actually I can ask you the same question. What do you recommend, or what do you recommend? But this is actually, I can tell you, after the law passed, this was like dinner conversation across Delaware. I can't tell you how many conversations. Should we do a reverse merger? Should we have a trustee? There are so many, and it's a little complicated, but you know what? You've got this really important new technology, new opportunity, and yeah, we're figuring out how to make the regulatory underpinnings work. And they will put it together, and it may be that there will be more laws, more amendments, refinements, but man, what a great first start. And I applaud the Corporation Law Council, the leadership of Matt O'Toole, but really all those lawyers who took this seriously before it was on a cover page of the New York Times Magazine. I mean, by the time they started talking, I think there was a cover story on The Economist, the something of trust, the machine of trust. Okay, so it wasn't so esoteric. The Economist was covering it, right? But they went out on a limb, and I will tell you, those lawyers. They talked, not only they talked to the experts, they talked to colleagues around the country and around the world to get their input. So it was not lightly that they engaged in those meetings and conversations and exploration and drafting and pushing to get the law passed.
So, Parth, I'll ask you the next question because, in the state of Delaware in particular, there's an entire industry around, the registration of companies, registered agents, and so on. How do you think these amendments are going to change that industry moving forward?
And what I'd like to pick up a little more on, Andrea, is one of the things I loved about how they went with the legislation was very general. One of the things that people love about Delaware is you go in front of there. If you're a corporation, you get certainty. You've got a history of corporate law, and then you've got chancery court opinions. You know what you're going to do. Given this was new, I really like the fact they went broad. They kind of gave you a big picture. This is what you can do on it. And then instead of these legislators and lawyers or trying to figure it out, let the industry work its way through, which is where we're going to get to. How do we get a traditional over to a blockchain? Well, let the industry work, let the corporations work its way through and come up with a
And come up with a good path. It's sort of like business processes, so it may be that they'll come up with all sorts of, it may be sort of a convoluted path, and then you know what? The lawyers will look at it and say, well, maybe if we all say this is the way to go, maybe we should create that in the legislation to make it that much easier.
Almost getting to a reg, putting it through whether you need it or just getting into best practice. I think the registered agent part of it doesn't change. I mean, that really is not impacted by this. What's going to be interesting to see, and it's going to be more on the public company side, and we'll see where it develops, is where the transfer agents come in and how the SEC and the transfer agents come together. Because you've got this whole process, you've got the ability to do those broker held, street name held transfers, and we're going to wait to see how that goes. I think there's going to be some impact, but I think the industries are so creative, they're going to find a way to make this work because that is in the future.
There's motivation, right? Because because the technology removes the friction, right? And you don't have to trust because the technology does that for you.
I mean, in theory, if you look at some of the ones that they're pointing to, you get rid of the overvoting issues. You get rid of the who's the owner on a certain day because it's real time on the block, as opposed to did it catch up? If I've got a certificated share as opposed to a street name share, where do the transfers occur? Do I really have the right person in front of me? So, what I love about it is the fact that they've given general framework, and then on the very important things, what does your stock ledger have to have? They actually define it and said you've got to be able to search it. You have to be able to find these 4 things within a stock ledger kept on the blockchain. So you've got that certainty, but then everything else, let's figure out
the best way that's going to work for the law for protection of investors in the company, but also in practice.
So Caitlin, can I ask you, or do you want to?
I wanted to pick up on the open voting point because I dug out the statistics from the, well, Dole Foods is a shocking case, right? That was where there were 49.2 million valid claims filed for only 36.7 million Dole Foods shares outstanding. So the accounting systems of Wall Street created 12.5 million real claims for phantom Dole shares that didn't ever exist. But I wanted to pick up your point on voting because the Procter & Gamble voting proxy contest that just took place, and by the way, the Dole Food case was a Delaware Chancery Court opinion in February of last year, so just under a year ago, so it's very recent. But the Procter & Gamble one is amazing. I had to dig these numbers out. I don't know why the press, candidly, didn't really write more about that Procter & Gamble case. I'm pretty sure that's a Delaware corporation, maybe you know, yeah. But that was by far the longest, or the most expensive proxy battle in U.S. history. I think it was $60 million was spent. So the first count of votes had Procter & Gamble's candidate winning over Nelson Peltz's candidate by 6.2 million votes. And then there was a recount, and it swung. Nelson Peltz won by 42,780 votes, right? So again, let me drive these numbers home. The first count was plus 6.2 million. The second count was minus 42,780. And then they had another recount, and it swung back to Procter & Gamble by plus 498,312. Again, let me give you those numbers. Start with plus 6.2, swing to minus 42,780, end at plus 498,312. Procter & Gamble decided to give Nelson Peltz a seat on the board, and my layman interpretation was they just didn't want to keep counting because to be candid, nobody knew who won that proxy contest. I'm an outsider, I don't know the people involved, but the reason why nobody knew who won that proxy contest is because the record-keeping systems on Wall Street cannot keep accurate track of who really owns what. And it's a fascinating dichotomy because Delaware law says that one share equals one vote. Delaware law says that the record owner of securities is the beneficial owner. But that's not what federal securities law says. And Vice Chancellor Lasser's opinion, he gave a speech in October 2016 where he called blockchain the plunger that's going to clean up the capital markets. And he goes through the history of what the SEC requires of broker-dealers when they're allowed to estimate the vote. Can you imagine if our political elections were done this way, right? And this, to me, it helps explain why it's so difficult for shareholders to kick out managements of corporations. So there are all kinds of issues with proxy voting. There was another case, the Yahoo proxy vote, where one of the shareholders, this was 10 years ago or so, but one of the shareholders knew that the proxy vote was inaccurate, asked for a recount, and they found 20% of the votes were miscounted. So it's just staggering how inaccurate the voting systems on Wall Street are. And again, I had to go do a lot of digging on my own to find those numbers. I didn't see anybody in the press who weaved that story together to say, hey, something's really wrong here. But Vice Chancellor Lasser is all over this in the Delaware Chancery Court. So he, in fact, actually completely independent of Andrea's work, was talking about this, and then ultimately you found each other and realized that you had a lot that you could help do with each other.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about a private blockchain versus a public blockchain? I mean, how would that work in practice where, especially for public corporations or even just private ones?
Well, blockchains are just database technologies, and so whether it's open to the public or whether it's private and permissioned is a decision of the user of the system, and there will be appropriate applications for each. And the nature of decentralization is not dependent upon whether the blockchain is open or whether it's permissioned, open and public versus permissioned. The nature of decentralization is there somebody who has a super node status in the network, somebody who has a validator role, an operator role, a notary role. These are the the centralized functions that the blockchain-inspired architectures in in enterprise blockchain are using. And when you see phrases like that, what you should realize is that's not a decentralized blockchain. A decentralized blockchain is one in which all the nodes have equal power, and so there is no centralization, no backdoor gatekeeper that has an information advantage. And as you can imagine, the financial sector has a real desire to keep information advantages because it has information advantages now. So this is one thing that I would caution everybody to look at in terms of which blockchains are implemented is somebody trying to keep an information advantage through the structure of the technology that's being implemented, or is it truly decentralized where everybody's equal and it's jump ball and a level playing field?
And I would say that those technologies, they're not going to broadcast, by the way, there's a backdoor, by the way, there's an administrator, by the way, there's a trustee. There's an example of that actually in the public. You may have, people who are following the Ethereum and the kitty, what is the smart kitties and crypto kitties, right? Everything, oh, this is so cool, decentralized, up and down, and then we find out, wait, no, not really decentralized because somebody had a contractual ability to go in and make changes. And so what are we really talking about? Is this really a blockchain application? I mean, yeah, but is it decentralized? Not so much. So I think it's very, very important because those exceptions, they're going to be in the details, in the very, very small print. And you really have to ask about that. Or you really may not be on something that's decentralized, truly decentralized.
So are we getting a sense of whether other states outside of Delaware will recognize Delaware corporations that have been incorporated in this way? I mean, this is a completely novel thing. Maybe.
Or I would like to hear what Greg has to say. Will this impact the way their companies treat Delaware?
I think that's an interesting question. So I'm a securities regulator, so I sort of bring a different perspective to all of this. And I think between the time that I was asked to consider being on this panel and today, there have been so many different either consumer announcements or actually actions taken around cryptocurrency and blockchain related offerings that it's pretty incredible how fast it's moving. But so I say all that, but I also would like to say that the characteristics of the technology that would solve this sort of proxy count problem, like the creation of an immutable record. As a regulator, that is something that is extremely interesting to me. Because if we can get to a place where a regulator has an access to an immutable record of transactions, that's going to make my job way, way easier. So sort of at a high level, I think that this technology is very powerful, and I think it can be sort of advantageous to regulators if it's implemented in the right way. Obviously, there are all sorts of concerns about investor protection and the hype surrounding cryptocurrency. And everybody talks about cryptocurrency, and that's the big thing in the news, but that's one very small slice of what we're talking about here today. So, bringing that back to the Delaware Blockchain Initiative and what the amendments actually permit, they sort of already presuppose that it involves the issuance of a security. And so this big question that everybody's been talking about, is a token a security? Like, that's already answered when you're talking specifically about the amendments to the Delaware General Corporate Law. And so all of the securities registration requirements and compliance requirements that are triggered when something is deemed to be a security, those things are not going to change. There's been no change to the Delaware Securities Act. It's just being applied to this new form of capital raising when there is, in fact, a security involved. So I don't think I answered your question, but I hope I touched on a little bit of what we've been talking about.
Why don't we talk about the sexy topic, token sales? We have investors and startup founders in the room. If any, what are the advantages of a startup that is intending on doing a token sale of incorporating in Delaware, if any?
Well, I think the advantages that Parth discussed earlier, which is sort of you know what you're going to get. There's a lot of clarity. The Delaware Chancery Court, gives you certainty. But in terms of complying with the securities laws, I mean, those laws haven't changed. So you're going to have to comply with federal securities laws, and you're going to have to comply with state securities laws in the states in which you plan to offer your security for sale. So the big threshold question that's been in the news lately is, does a token constitute a security? And I unfortunately cannot answer that question generally here today because it's very facts and circumstances specific. But I'm sure you guys have seen sort of the report of investigation that the SEC put out in July about the DAO, where they talk about the Howey test and what an investment contract is. And you're seeing state regulators also applying that same test really recently, in particular with Massachusetts filed a complaint against Caviar for selling unregistered securities in connection with a token sale, and also for failing to register, for the individual failing to register as an issuer agent. So basically, they looked at what was going on. They said, we think that what you're doing constitutes the sale of a security, and because it constitutes the sale of a security, the Massachusetts Securities Act applies, and you need to register. You need to be registered as an issuer agent, and you didn't do that.
Well, Greg, in Delaware, though, if this had happened in Delaware, in that case, it's a little unique because I think the issuer, its claim, thought he was doing a Regulation S offering. So we'll leave that to the side for a moment. But in Delaware, if there was a Delaware corporation that is doing a token sale, how does one register a token as a security in the state of Delaware?
Yeah, so you can register securities in the state of Delaware in two ways, by coordination and qualification. I presume that an offering that's going to take place in the state of Delaware is also going to take place in other states. And so, you would probably have to register your offering with the SEC as well. And I can get into technical detail about what's required in a registration by qualification or coordination. But basically, it's all about disclosure. And it's all about making sure that prospective investors in the offering have the information that they need to make an informed decision. And that's the same thing at the federal level. And so you have to file a registration statement with the SEC. You basically file a copy of that with my office. There are a couple other forms that aren't really substantive in nature. And then we have the discretion to review what you give us and then ask for additional information if there are questions. So that's the process. It's clearly laid out in the statute and the rules. And there's a filing fee involved. Delaware is a disclosure state. So one thing that I wanted to make sure people understood is that different states have different ways that they review securities registrations. Delaware is disclosure. So what that means is that if you've filled out the forms correctly and you've told people what it is you're doing, then you will have met our requirements. So the idea there is, investors can read the information that you're giving to us and that you're giving to them, and they can make an informed decision about whether or not they think this is something they want to invest in. We don't review the merits of the offering unless there's potential fraud involved. But at the outset, initially, we're not going to review the merits of the offering. There are certain states that do conduct what's called merit review. So it varies by state, and if you're going to be offering a security for sale in multiple states, you need to understand what level of review is going to take place in each of those states.
And so is there any advice that you could give for the audience on how to ensure that their token is not a security under Delaware state law?
Talk to a good lawyer. Oh, and by the way, I'm not allowed to give anyone legal advice since I work for the government.
And we can't, nothing that this panel says today can be construed as legal advice, even though we are all lawyers here, but we are not your client. So we can't give you legal advice. This is all general information.
So if you're considering doing a token sale and you really don't think that what you're doing constitutes the offer or sale of a security, number one, talk with a good lawyer who understands this. Go through the Howey analysis and make sure that you believe that you're not meeting the various components of that analysis. I would say if you go through that analysis and you're not sure, that's a bad sign, because a regulator will go through that analysis and probably say, yeah, it's a security. And then the last thing I would say on that subject is the SEC has a no action, you can submit a no action letter to the SEC. So if you really don't know and you really do not want to get into trouble, you could request no action from the SEC, which would basically require you to write a letter, say this is what we want to do. We would like you to tell us whether or not you would take action if we move forward with the sale. And that type of state securities regulators have that type of thing as well. It's called an interpretive opinion in Delaware. It's in our rules, so you could make a request for that. I think, so I wanted to highlight a recent case on this point at the federal level, which was involved the Munshi sale, because Munshi claimed that they went through the Howey analysis and determined that they weren't issuing a security, and the SEC disagreed. So I just wanted to make people aware of that, because that's sort of illustrative of the point that I was making, that, you know, you need to go through the analysis, and if there's any question, you know, you might, if you're in a gray area, it might not be worth the risk of moving forward.
But Greg, you would also question them not to do it alone without advice of counsel.
Correct, yes.
Well, actually, even on that point, I think the SEC chairman just made comments about sort of a warning to securities lawyers. So for those of you who are, you know, potential clients, you may hear what you don't want to hear. Unfortunately, there are some securities lawyers out there that are may give you advice that is not accurate. So just, unfortunately, in the majority of cases, I think it's safe to say a token is likely to be considered a security. I don't think there's any way around it in the way that they're being structured today. That might change in the future, but I think that's sort of general.
But if they're on a secondary, especially if they're on a secondary market.
Listed, right.
Yeah, can I say one more thing on that point too? I mean, at a high level, this is really about looking at the substance of the offering over the form. So that's a theme that has sort of emerged from all these cases. And so it doesn't really matter what you call whatever it is you're offering. You could call it a token, you could call it a coin, you could call it something else. The SEC is going to look to the substance, and they're going to apply Howey, and state regulators, I think, will do the same. Certainly in Delaware, that's what we would do.
So I'm just conscious of time. I'd like to leave some time at the end for some questions. Caitlin or Andrew, could you talk a little bit about the Simeon technology and how that's going to actually work in Delaware or in other states as well? Are there other states that some of you may be aware of?
I can talk about Wyoming, but maybe if you don't mind telling
Well,
me.
I can talk generally about the technology. Simeon's technology is a permissioned blockchain, which means that all the parties on the blockchain are vetted. It's not a public protocol that can be downloaded that people can participate in like Bitcoin or Ethereum. It's completely decentralized, so all the participants are nodes on the blockchain. What's really great about the technology is that this is a institutional. This was created for the financial market, institutional grade. It is scalable. It is ready. It is being deployed. Because a lot of times, a lot of folks you read in the paper about different blockchains, they go, "This is good for a use case," but it really can't handle the number of transactions, or it goes slow, or it stops. You know, when they're big. That's not Simeon's problem. It's ready. It's there. Some other basic additional features which you don't hear about from other blockchains is that you can actually put documents right on this particular blockchain. So not only is it maintaining a ledger, but you can sign documents, and the documents are maintained on the ledger, and it's connected to the transaction. There are all sorts of private, public keys so that you can keep information private. The parties to the transaction, they decide together what information each other sees. So you don't have a lot of the privacy issues that you hear with some of the other technologies. That's sort of the big picture. I know I worked with them directly when I was with the State of Delaware. They had been identified as the state's technology partner when we launched the blockchain initiative. But I'm not a technologist, so I cannot give you all the specifics. I just know what I saw, and they have built a stock ledger. It is built. It is beautiful. I know that they are working on a lot of other applications in the space. So it's.
Thank you. So what's going on in Wyoming?
In other states. So I think the one that is probably the most interesting and near term is Wyoming. But there are initiatives that are sort of nipping on the heels of Delaware, if you will, in Nevada and Arizona and Utah as well. But Wyoming is interesting because it's the number 3 state behind Delaware and Nevada for new business entity formations. It's where LLCs were invented. And Delaware obviously overtook Wyoming in LLC, in the number of LLCs formed. But actually there's almost 1 LLC for every 2 citizens of Wyoming. So there's a joke that Delaware's biggest export is incorporations, and in Wyoming it's almost LLCs because there's so many that have been formed. And what's interesting about Wyoming for the sector, I'm part of the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition, and the reason is I grew up there. So I'm supporting an effort to bring this opportunity beyond just the state of Delaware. There are 3 bills, actually probably 4, that are going to be coming up to the legislative session in a few weeks. It starts February 12th. The first one has to do with Bitcoin and allowing the money transmitters to come into the state. The second one, and that's got so many co-sponsors, it's very likely to happen. The second one is probably the most interesting to the community, which is that it defines a utility token and how that can be exempt from state securities laws. So, and that combined with the third one, which is essentially the Delaware Blockchain Bill, which enables incorporations and LLC registrations on a blockchain. And the fourth one has to do with forming series LLCs, which are really helpful for Internet of Things type devices for managing liability. So if you manufacture a self-driving car, each car is actually, when it's manufactured, is owned by its own LLC. But you set up a series LLC, so you've got the mothership, if you will, and then all the children hanging off it. It just is it really helps for the administration of LLCs. When you combine the second and third bills, which is the ICO bill and the state filings bill, with the existing laws in Wyoming, which are there's no state income tax, no franchise taxes, no corporate income tax, and there's also strict privacy for LLC members. This starts to become really interesting. So Wyoming's really making a run for becoming its own haven for this industry. Unlike Delaware, which has the Corporation Law Council that Andrea referred to, so in some ways it wasn't a surprise that the law passed in Delaware with such flying colors because there was only one person, I can't remember if it was the House or the Senate, who voted against it. It was nearly unanimous in both houses. Because they have such respect for the Corporation Law Council. So when the Corporation Law Council says, here's our package of changes to Delaware corporate law, the legislature usually agrees. There's no such thing in Wyoming. So the legislative process in Wyoming is going to be more difficult. We will be shortly releasing some more information about that ICO bill and asking for the community's help. Now, is this something, how does this relate to Delaware? It's interesting because one of the things that we did in Wyoming that we didn't do in Delaware was put an implementation date in the law for when the Secretary of State is required to integrate with a blockchain. So that hasn't happened in Delaware yet. And So, the second time around, we realized we need to actually put an implementation date that requires the Secretary of State to implement. So it'll be interesting to see. First of all, the law has to pass, and then second of all, it has to get implemented within a certain, I think they're giving them a year to implement it. So it has created a little bit of a race between Delaware and Wyoming. Delaware passed the law, obviously, last June, but it hasn't implemented yet at the Division of Corporations. So the real value of the Delaware Blockchain Initiative is not available yet to corporations, which is allowing registrations to be done directly on a blockchain, which would enable everyone to trace the provenance of every share back to verify that it was legally authorized in the first place. That fixes the record ownership issue. That fixes the proxy voting issue. That enables corporate records to be automated using smart contracts. Right now, the law enables companies to do all that, but you have a break in the digital chain of information because you still have all of your state filings outside of a blockchain.
Yeah.
And in some cases, it's in paper. I'm an investor in one of the early blockchain startups, and I laughed when I got my piece of paper for my share certificate in the mail for a blockchain startup. It's a Delaware corporation, it's a piece of paper. So you have a break in the digital chain, and until the state is integrated into the blockchain, you can't fix that break in the digital chain of information.
So what's the timing you think in Wyoming?
Well, there'll be more information released about the bill. It's still going through the legislative process. There's some very, very senior legislators who have signed on, including the Speaker of the House. They're trying to get the President of the Senate. Hopefully that'll happen as soon as today. Once that happens, they'll probably release this. So stay tuned. You'll see the bill in the next couple of days, but then it's got to pass the legislature. So that's, we just don't know. But the implementation would be by January 1st of next year. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank my panelists. I would like to leave some time for questions. Before we begin, let me just make a quick announcement. First of all, thank you again. Round of applause for as well as to everyone who helped organize the event today, Megan Pennick, Catherine Robertson, and Marina Firugu-Kuluri. Also, our next blockchain breakfast is going to be on February 26th, if I'm not mistaken. It's going to be about the tax and estate consequences of having a large crypto portfolio, as we're in tax season, folks. So anyway, with that, who has a question, please? Yes.
What are some examples of companies who are early adopters of blockchain who have actually implemented it as part of their record keeping, and is there a list of them somewhere out there?
Not to my knowledge.
Or do you have some examples at least?
I think a lot of companies are waiting for the state to integrate, because there's no sense in putting all the records on a blockchain and then having to redo that when the state is integrated and may not be using exactly the same protocol, for example. Yeah, but I'm sure there are companies out there doing this. A lot of the
I know
startups.
there are, because we're getting inquiries and people are and I'm hearing through the grapevine. Actually, Delaware attorneys are telling me that they're getting called and clients are just going to get started and they're doing it. So I don't know who they are, but I know it's happening.
So while the state has allowed for this to happen, it's not a requirement, and actually there aren't that many companies who are actually going ahead and putting their information out there on the blockchain, correct?
So, well, just to clarify, the state has created the regulatory environment so that companies can legally and without any issue maintain their corporate records on blockchain. The greatest value is when the Division of Corporations integrates with the technology, because then you file, and as Caitlin said, the information, the number of authorized shares, the name of the corporation that information flows seamlessly. So there's no opportunity for someone in the middle to make a change. It flows seamlessly onto a stock ledger, which lives on the blockchain. And then at the same time, shares are issued onto that. So you've got the authorized shares, that's on the stock ledger, issued shares right onto the stock ledger. And then that information cannot be changed unless the parties to the transaction are authorized to do so. And then you have the stock ledger is actually a smart contract. So everyone's shares are issued, often there are restrictions on their transfer. All of that is programmed into the stock ledger. It's a smart contract. Are companies taking advantage of the regulatory, the new regulations? Yes, they are. We know this anecdotally from lawyers, from others who say they're doing it. I field calls from around the world that have told me they're incorporating Delaware because of the new law, because they want to maintain their shares.
But, as Caitlin said, the real value is when there is integration. And there are companies that are going to wait to even incorporate. They're privately held, they're large, they're waiting. Or publicly held companies that are contemplating that this will happen, and they're working with the lawyers and the lawyers at this firm, right, to figure out how do they go from being a traditional company to being a company that has its shares now on a distributed ledger. This will all happen. Will it happen next year, the year after? Who knows? This like the train is moving forward.
We'll stick around afterwards, so if you have more specific questions about how this will actually get done, Parth can also help out on.
And I think,
I'm just looking for examples, to be honest.
and what you're going to see on this really is, like I understand, the public companies not only have the Delaware issue, but they've got NASDAQ, their listing exchange, they've got the SEC, so they're all waiting. So if there are private companies, you're not going to necessarily hear about them as well, because they're a small private company with 10, where it may make sense for them to do it. The other things, the other corporate records, they may say, okay, I don't really need that third-party verification or something, I can keep that in. So you're not going to hear about it until either the SEC or some of the exchanges, the OTC comes around and says, hey, we're going to allow you to do it, and that's when it's going to become public. But it is happening, people are looking at it. And I think it's more of the planning stages are going on. We're ready to go, we're going to wait for some regulation, or we're going to wait for, somebody to take the leap, do it, and see where they come out, and then follow up. So whenever it gets in, I think you're going to see it then avalanche out. But when that first one starts, that kind of going to be a year, 2 years, maybe 6 months, it's going to wait.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for all the work you've done in Delaware. I think it's cool that you've gone digital, the digital change. It has to start somewhere. It has to start either at the courthouse or the state house. Once it's digital, then you can do a lot of things. I've set up many companies in Delaware, and some have a few shareholders, some have a lot of shareholders, okay? If I'm setting up a new digital LLC in Delaware, and I'm not asking for advice, okay? If I'm setting up a new Delaware corporation and I'm issuing shares, and I'm issuing those shares in some form, and let's say that I want to settle those shares as tokens, because I can give the tokens to my shareholders. All at once, in the old way, I was issuing shares and they weren't securities, and now I'm issuing shares and they are securities.
Shares are, if you're issuing shares, the shares
If they're
are
in a token.
piece of the ownership, right? A share is the way it's an equity. It's the way you convey ownership in the
So
company.
is there a limit of the number of tokens that I can issue in the form of shares before it becomes a security?
No, totally different framework,
Okay.
right? Totally. You're not. This is a big conversation, but it's a different way of thinking about it.
Okay, so nothing to be concerned about.
I can address that under the Delaware Securities Act, though.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to.
Yeah, so if you're issuing securities, then the Delaware Securities Act applies. And that's true whether you're issuing LLC membership interests or you're issuing tokens. And that means that the securities that you're issuing need to either be registered or exempt from registration. And so we would look to the exemptions from registration in these types of circumstances. There are 13 different securities that by definition are exempt from registration, and there are 15 transactional exemptions from registration. An exemption would most likely apply to the situation that you're describing, but you would have to consult with an attorney
So the
to
definition
figure that
is
out.
what is a security and what is not a security by state law.
Well,
Thank you.
just to pick up on what you be aware of, because you have an exemption from registration, either security type or transactional, the fact that you're issuing there, it's a security. You may not have to register it, so be careful. The anti-fraud rules never go away.
Yeah.
So because you call it a security, you don't call it a security, the anti-fraud provisions are always going to trump everything. So don't structure so much around I'm a security, not a security, I'm going to register or not. The big question is, again, and going back to where Delaware is, it's disclosure. If you put an investor and give them all the information, that's what they're looking for, and that's what the SEC, that's what the federal court's going to do. So that's really got to be the focus. The registration part of it will get into a cost perspective and timing, but it's not going to get you out of the fraud issues.
Good answer. Thank you.
Are there any distinctions of keeping your information on the public blockchain like a required number of nodes to operate?
I think it has more to do with, and I don't have the language in front of me, but it has to do with agency and having the blockchain be an agent. And so there are some certain requirements that if you use a private blockchain, for the most part, you basically have done what you need to do. But with a public blockchain, there are some additional steps. It's not insurmountable. But there are certain things you need to do to make sure that there is. I believe it's agency, but there are a couple of minor steps. Yes.
I have two questions. One is, can you compare, maybe I have it wrong, what Overstock has done for releasing shares to what Delaware is offering? And two, Andrea, you mentioned that all the participants would be nodes on the decentralized network. What would examples of those participants be? Down to what, like, is it down to the shareholder level, or are we talking about brokers, or down to what level?
Overstock issued preferred shares using T0. I am, full disclosure, I did invest in that security. It was interesting because from what I recall, and don't quote me on this, you'd have to look at the documents, I don't think they got a legal opinion that was compliant with Delaware law. They did that before the Delaware law passed. But at the time I thought to myself, well, who's really going to challenge this as to whether it was okay to keep track of the securities on a blockchain? Because the only circumstance in which that would have been challenged is if something went wrong, and it hasn't. And even then, it wasn't even clear that that there would be liability. To Andrea's point, the law subsequently came and was passed that there is no liability for keeping corporate books and records on a blockchain. So they're good, but they did take, I think, a little bit of legal risk at the time in doing that. They didn't take SEC risk; it was a fully registered preferred security. But the Delaware law hadn't passed at that time, if I'm remembering the timing correctly. What they're doing with T0 now is a securities token. And I have looked at the documents there. It's a simple agreement for future equity. So there's going to be a two-stage securities offering. One is a token registered as a security, fully registered up front with a full, but it's Reg D and Reg S, private offering. They have the full qualified institutional buyer, know your customer, anti-money laundering, compliance done up front. It's taking them a lot more time, and they're getting some pressure from the community. Why isn't this happening faster? Well, because the compliance requirements are so high to literally certify every investor. They've got to go through that whole compliance process first before they can collect the money, and then issue the tokens. But then there will be a second step, because that's a simple agreement for future equity. So there is future equity coming. They will have to register those securities at some point. Kodak Coin is being done the same way. I think that's the way the token market is going for these two-stage securities offerings. One is a simple agreement for future equity, or simple agreement for future securities token, a SAFT. I've never heard anyone say that, but that's kind of what it is. And then eventually there'll be a second step, but there's a 1-year lockup under Reg D. So my advice to Overstock is to make sure the community knows that, because a lot of folks are going to be thinking this thing's going to start trading. It's not, except the Reg S piece of it can offshore, right? But the Reg D piece onshore can't for a year. Everybody's locked up for a year.
Caitlin, but in those cases, I think they're exempted offerings. They're not registered offerings.
That's right. Yeah, the first leg is exempt, is Reg D, Reg S, but that next leg pretty clearly is going to have to be registered. And then it's also worth saying, Overstock, when they invested in Symbiont, did announce that they expect or want to be one of the first. It would be Medici Ventures, their subsidiary, to issue the securities on a blockchain and use once the state integrates, and use that as a means by which to track LP interest in Medici Ventures. So that they're lined up and ready to go as soon as the state integrates.
So just to answer the part 2 of your question, is if we're talking about here a permissioned ledger, and let's just take the example of a stock ledger on a permissioned blockchain. You might have different nodes, participating nodes, and actually there may be many nodes on a blockchain on a permission. but you might have, for example, if you have the company might have their executives have a node, the company management might have a node, the law firm might have a node. It could be all of the parties that the company does business with. If they have large shareholders, perhaps the large shareholder has a node. Perhaps the accountant has a node. And frankly, like I said, there may be. And the regulator might have a node. Now, what's really exciting, interesting about this immune technology is that because of the way it was created and the cryptography involved, you can have permission to different levels. So certain people who are entitled and authorized to see certain information can see it. For example, if you had a regulator, like Greg's office at the DOJ, no, it would not be a supernode. No, absolutely not. It's completely decentralized. But he may only have permission to see the activity, but not who the people are.
It's a read-only node.
It may be read-only. It may, like I said, he may only see. You could even, he may only he might be looking at the activity, but not the names of the individuals. You could even imagine accounting firms on watching lots of their clients' activity and sort of, again, not knowing the individuals, but they could see anomalies or issues if things come back, then they have a perfect record. I also imagined a company like Palantir. They work within the CIA, they detect fraud, they consume massive amounts of data. You could imagine that they're on a node. So let's say you have this one company on the blockchain, but you could have hundreds and thousands of companies and in different industries on the blockchain, on the very same blockchain, but they're only those who have permission to access certain transactions will have access to certain information. So you could imagine not just the department, you could imagine the DOJ from every state, you could imagine the SEC. The blockchain could make not just clarity and transparency, but what we didn't really talk about was the security that it brings to the corporate community.
Yes. Excuse me. Thank you.
Now, you are going over Delaware. Do you have any outlook on what would happen with other states? And the example I draw from is Quebec, where they've made an exception for token sales. You have to register, but you're exempt from most of the filings. And also passporting as well. So if you're registered in Quebec, you can get the entire, all Canadian provinces covered. So is there any provision that you foresee coming with New York, all other states, or even at the federal level for such? If you register in Delaware on a blockchain and being able to passport to other states?
I don't see that in the near future. I think there's definitely coordination, certainly amongst state regulators on these issues, and with the SEC as well. And so, there are certain offerings that are done in multiple states that go through a coordinated review process that's sort of administered by the North American Securities Administrators Association. And, we have Canadian members as well. So it's possible that in the future, these types of offerings might be subject to a coordinated review among the regulators in the states where they're going to be offered, but I think that's pretty far down the road.
Thanks for joining us, by the way. Has anyone spent time thinking about the applications of a stop ledger for maybe some more arcane structures? I'm thinking of, like MLPs, UPCs, multiple shared classes, and how having kind of your primary incorporation occur digitally might impact those setups.
Yeah, you keep your entire ledger on the blockchain using smart contracts. So, and that's the way Delaware law requires it. Actually, it's not a combination. It's an either or. If you choose to use a blockchain to register your shares, you're doing it for your entire cap table.
So I imagine this scenario in which, let's say the company is structured as a partnership with private units that are owned by shares, like a classic option.
Sure. Yeah.
Those units could be independently, privately owned in a traditional format, but anything that's listed and shared basically is on the ledger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I don't quite know everything we're talking about. So.
Yeah, like you said.
But you have a cap table, you have ledger, there's smart contracts. I mean, everything would be programmed accordingly.
But it can handle the complex structures.
Complex.
Yeah.
But an LLP, is that what you're referring to? And a triple LP or that type of structure?
I'm just suggesting that
Yeah.
the units traditionally are privately owned while the shares own the units. There's tax advantages to the structure.
Yeah.
the units be traditionally structured, the shares be digitally.
Not change anything. It's just this is just a database
Right.
structure. It's just a different database structure. It doesn't change the legal structure at all.
Yeah.
And I think just getting back to where Delaware says, if it's on your equity cap table, then you gotta decide one or the other. So you do the analysis, if the units would be showing up on the cap table, then they've gotta be digital. If the structure isn't such that those don't, then they can be held in traditional form. That's kind of the analysis you want to do.
With legislation catching up to pretty much blockchain technology, how are we going to regulate artificial intelligence? And as far as, I mean, it's already in place now, as far as like trading bots and things of that nature. But how are we, how are we warranting that potentially?
I don't know.
That's a whole other event.
That's your next event.
Yeah.
And you get the professionals who can actually answer that question.
It's a good question because I think a lot of people are struggling with it at the regulator level and the proxy level.
As far as like a micro level, just to put it more in perspective, because we're setting new laws that will ultimately affect a new future pretty much. We're pretty much controlling technology, but we're getting closer to technology actually being enforcing itself.
Well, what I would say, I actually wrote an article on this about legislation. And my viewpoint about the legislation is that when you're thinking about legislation and regulatory frameworks, before you go ahead and make the changes, see, is it really necessary? Like, is there anything preventing us from using AI? If not, then, you know, from my perspective, you don't necessarily need to legislate around it unless you have a concern that you're going to go do it and then it's going to be disrupted. But generally, you know, if you see that there's something that's preventing you, then yeah, make the change. But if not, you know, not so.
I would bring that up as far as because we're kind of the law is catching up to the technology. So if there's more artificial intelligence inside the economy, there will have to be an agreement to something that the law actually has a system for.
I need to understand. I mean, I'm happy to talk to you offline. I just, like I said, I think a lot of times there's people legislate, they don't need to legislate, right? But sometimes people want to put a law in place to make absolutely sure that they have authorization, and that might be the case. But I would tell you, if you're thinking about that, education is so important to make sure that people who are in your community, in the legal community, the business community, the legislative community, the government, make sure they really understand what we're talking about, because it's so easy for the winds to blow back and forth, and sometimes they blow a lot of misinformation around, and then you're like behind the eight ball trying to like get everybody back on track.
Because the gap is very large, and I just feel like law is pretty much very vulnerable in these times as far as the economy is concerned.
I mean, I think my sense is, especially given, like to put Delaware in context, right? So we spoke a little bit about Dubai. Obviously, there are other countries as well that are very eager.
Estonia, for example.
Central Republic of Georgia, Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, countries that you wouldn't ordinarily think of as kind of huge innovators. But, so I think we understand, and I had this conversation with the Secretary of State of Delaware, because I think we need to understand that as Americans, as American innovators and American lawyers, we are competing with now, you know, many smarter, more efficient regimes in other jurisdictions. So I think everyone's well aware of that, and I think that's, if I can assume, that's a bit of the push of like, well, you know, America, I don't think regulators want to discourage innovation within the U.S., but you have to understand, obviously, we live in the real world, and it's got to be done in the context of compliance, ultimately. So where there are industries like AI that we don't have legislation on, you know, I think, for example, the SEC or in your office has been really open about, a dialogue. And I think I hope that'll continue.
But you make a really good point about, you're talking about Wyoming or other states. We're really competing with the world. I mean, it's not just Delaware or Wyoming or Delaware, it's Delaware or Estonia or Dubai. I mean, people come, the money flows where there's the least amount of friction, right? I can tell you, I know lots and lots of companies that are choosing to incorporate in other countries because, granted, we've got great laws, we've got great courts and everything else, and innovation, but the world, it's just a lot easier to transact. Yeah.
I just thought it was right as far as Delaware letting the floodgates in, pretty much.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else?
Question on corporate action. So it's part of the Delaware Initiative. Is that specifically addressed in the regulation, or is that seen as just maintenance? corporate actions and, stock splits and those types of things happening on the ledger.
So, nothing's changed in Delaware law on what you need to do for a corporate action. I mean, if it needs board approval, it needs board approval.
But on the blockchain specifically, and what you guys are designing on the blockchain.
Well, the corporate actions could be on the blockchain. I mean, the action, the document, that it could, I mean, there's nothing to keep folks from looking at the action, from voting using the technology, and it from being stored right there on the blockchain. I mean, I would imagine that smart contract
You're gonna handle all the corporate actions on the blockchain once you go there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's there. It's so many disputes. I was a law clerk on the Court of Chancery many moons ago, and so many disputes are which is the document, which is the governing document, which one's valid, which one was validly signed, this one wasn't validly voted on, or which is the valid governing document. I mean, with blockchain, with this solution, those disputes go away. And some of the lawyers, when we were talking about this over the summer, they're like, Andrea, you're gonna put me out of business. Like, I'm a litigation lawyer, this is my bread and butter. I'm like, okay, your disputes aren't, there'll be new disputes, different disputes, that you won't be disputing which is the governing document, but there will be other disputes, and there'll be whole new avenues for lawyers to develop new practices around smart contracting and advice and helping their clients get on the blockchain and make sure things, or being nodes on the blockchain, right, along with Greg.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are law firms looking at big nodes on the blockchain to help ensure that there are no footfalls. Yeah, but to your point though, I don't think we met a single lawyer whose entire practice was fixing footfalls. It's actually probably the least interesting part of a lawyer's practice.
They get to do higher value issues and higher value advising, and it removes so much risk. So much risk.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. Look forward to